All right, when we left off, we were still in chapter 2, and we're starting with verse 17 today. Chapter 2, verse 17. And verse 17 is in the middle of a paragraph, so we'll back up a couple verses just to get the context. I'll start reading from 12. That's where the passage starts. And this is the letter to the church, the beginning of the letter to the church in Pergamum. And Jesus is dictating to John, and he says, verse 12, "And to the angel of the church in Pergamum write, the words of him who has the sharp two-edged sword. I know where you dwell, where Satan's throne is. You hold fast my name, and you did not deny my faith, even in the days of Antipas, my witness, my faithful one, who was killed among you where Satan dwells. But I have a few things against you. You have some there who hold the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak to put a stumbling block before the sons of Israel, that they might eat food sacrificed to idols and practice immortality. So you also have some who hold the teaching of the Nicolaitans. Repent then. If not, I will come to you soon and war against them with the sword of my mouth. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone, which no one knows except him who receives it." We're getting more into the deeper symbolism of the book of Revelation. It's going to start coming faster now. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on it, on the stone, which no one knows except him who receives it. So a name that God gives you, right? We all have a name that our parents gave us, right? We have names that we took at our confirmation, etc. But there is a name that God gives us.
That he will call us by.
Exactly, that we consciously don't even know now. But when the time comes, God will call us by that name, and we will intuitively know that this is our, what do you want to say, true name? Heavenly name? Divine name?
I often wondered what that really was, because I really had never heard that.
Right.
I've never heard that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a name.
Where is the scripture? I've never heard that before.
Okay. This is to him who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on it, which no one knows except him who receives it. So this is obviously a name written on a stone given to us by Christ, right? It reminds me of, and I don't know if they'll get into this in the commentary, but it reminds me of, in the ancient Greek world, we all know the word ostracize, right? It means sort of to be banished or to be excluded, right? And what that comes from is the ancient Greeks had a custom whenever there was an election or a vote, either choosing a person to do something or choosing between two proposals. The way they voted, at least in Athens, was they would pick up a broken piece of pottery. There was broken pottery everywhere in the ancient world because everything was made of terracotta, and so it was brittle. It broke a lot. All your olive oil, all your wine, etc. Well, you had skins, but you also had these clay pots, and they would break all the time. And so the way they voted was they'd pick up a piece of this broken pottery, a shard of broken pottery, and they'd write the name on it of the person who they wanted to lose, so to speak. So let's say there was an election between Bill and I, and everybody wanted Bill's idea, or they wanted Bill to occupy an office. They would write Kent on a piece of pottery. They'd collect all the shards of pottery, and whoever's name appeared most would be banished, would be ostracized. And that word comes from the fact that a broken piece, the Greek word for a broken piece of pottery, a shard of pottery, was called an ostraca. So if you were ostracized if your name came up most on the broken pottery.
It's strange they would do it that
So
way.
I don't.
You
This
would think that they would be voting for.
you would think. I don't get why they would do that. But that's how it worked, and I don't know if this really has any connection to this reading. But your name written on a stone, that's what it makes me think of. But the truth is, the names written on the stone here are the ones who faithfully endured to the end, right? To him who conquers, I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone with a new name written on the stone, which no one knows except him who receives it.
How about your confirmation name?
Maybe.
Could be.
But again,
That's the church.
yeah, right. Again, if no one knows it,
Well, and this is
Then-
the part I didn't understand. Is this a name that you get called at the hour of your death? Or am I
well,
confusing?
to him that's a good point, because think of this. The only way he describes the person is one who conquers.
Okay,
And
so
from the
then-
context, you see it's one who is, the comparison is this Antipas, who was a martyr. And so you kind of get the feeling that the one who conquers is the one whose faith endures to the end, even if it means at the cost of his life. So you follow the Spirit, you endure to the end, and Jesus gives you some of the hidden manna, which is interesting. Is that a Eucharistic reference, right? Because when Jesus in John 6 talked about the manna that comes down from heaven, he said, I am the true manna, and you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood to have eternal life. So there are these connections with this passage we're looking at right now. So he will give you some of the true manna. In other words, Christ himself will, what? Be the Eucharistic minister?
Hello.
Joan, hello. Come on in. And so is this a Eucharistic reference? Christ himself will administer himself to you. And this white stone, now white, again being purity, right, with your name on it. Of course, it also makes me wonder about, again, I don't know if there's an actual connection here, but it calls to mind when God says in the Old Testament, I will take out your hearts of stone and put in a heart of flesh and write my law on a heart of flesh. I won't write, in the first covenant, I wrote my law on stone, the 10 Commandments, but in the age to come, I will take out your stony hearts, give you hearts of flesh, and write my law in your heart of. I don't. Again, these are just random connections.
If you didn't recognize the name,
yeah.
what he calls you,
Yeah.
No.
you would be doing a dinero bit.
You talking to me?
Yeah. You talking to me? Who, me? Right. But what he's saying is, he says, no one knows it except him who receives it.
Okay.
So we will know
Yeah, right.
if we conquer. And we get a stone, we will know intuitively, this is my divinely, appointed name.
Oh, it's such
Divinely
mystery.
given name. Yeah,
Mysteries of our faith.
yeah. Right. So,
Way over my head.
now you could simply say, it calls to mind the question, is this all really symbolic? Are we
Right.
actually going to receive
Right.
an actual
I
white
think it
stone?
is. I
Right.
have to say, I think it is.
Exactly. So,
I don't think he's going to call me by another name. I don't.
okay,
I mean, there's a symbolism to that.
sure.
That applies to them, I think, in their situation.
Right.
Which he's writing.
But what you're looking at in this passage is there's a certain ambiguity. We don't
Yeah.
know whether to
Right.
take this literally. There's
Right,
there's
exactly.
nothing to bring
Yeah.
to bear upon it that dictates whether we should take it literally or
Right. I
symbolically.
mean, he'll call me by name as an adopted son.
Exactly.
But
Right.
whether it's going to be a name,
Yeah.
like a different name.
Right. Will he
I don't
say
know.
Bob? Or will
Or your
he
Christian,
somehow
or your-
call
right.
you in some way that you recognize? And what the interesting, I think, underlying that name that only you as an individual will know, it implies there is a certain element of your relationship with Jesus
Right.
that is absolutely unique.
Exactly.
Utterly unique. Only you will know this name. Whatever, if it's purely symbolic or if it's literally
Right.
what the implication is that your communion with Christ is utterly unique.
Yeah.
No one knows except him who
Well,
receives
see,
it.
and that's how I took it, that my relationship
Yes.
with Christ is
Yeah.
unique to me.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Completely unique to me.
Right.
So,
And one of the questions, I guess I want to say atheists tend to have, but anybody could really have it, is, if there are 5 billion people on the earth right now, how can God hear all our prayers?
exactly.
Right? If 5 billion, assuming everybody on the planet is praying,
Well, even if not.
but let's say, half the people on the planet are praying, 2.5 billion prayers going up to God simultaneously. How does he do this? Well, there's a funny movie called, what is it called? Bruce Almighty.
Oh, yeah.
And
Is that Jim, what's his face?
Jim Carrey, there were two of them. The first one was Steve Carell, and the second one was Jim
Heaven Almighty,
Carrey,
Bruce Almighty.
Jerry,
Carrey?
that's the guy.
Jim Carrey.
right? And I think it was the Bruce Almighty one. I don't remember.
Was
No,
it Morgan-
maybe Jim
it
Carrey was
Morgan
first.
Freeman, God in it?
Yes, Morgan Freeman was God. And there's this, God wants to take a vacation, and he appoints Bruce to cover for him while he's on vacation. And the way that Bruce is going to receive all these prayers is via this divine computer, an email.
Okay.
And so he says, I guess I better check the prayer email. So he sits down and he's reading an email, and it's like, you have a new message. A new message, a new message, a new message, and he's just getting all these new messages, and he can't keep up with it. So that's kind of a representation of this question. How can God do this, right? Well, ultimately, we don't know. It's not my mind that has to comprehend, several billion simultaneous prayers. It's the mind of God. So we just naturally infer that God has the capacity to do this, right? Well, that's kind of analogous to what we're talking about here. If God can simultaneously hear the prayers of billions of people at once, that means he has a unique line. I mean, picture the old, you know how you used to see the old telephone switchboard
Yeah,
operators, like Lily Tomlin I'm picturing, right? But, the old movies where you'd see them
I
going
used
like
to
this.
do that.
Okay, well, God's mind has all
Years
those
ago.
connections, right?
Old I am.
God's mind has all those connections going at once, right? He's the only operator, and he's got all the connections simultaneously going at once. And on each individual line, he's fully engaged, right? I can't do this. If you all started talking at once, I'd be lost, right? But God can do this. So he's got each individual connection maintained at any given time, implying that there's each individual relationship is being maintained
Well, he does know us each.
Yeah.
all at once.
I've also heard the analogy of a human being like reading a book.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a story of an individual's life. You pick it up, you put it down again. You take your time. So,
Sure.
I mean, that's
Yeah.
not the explanation, but it's kind of like an analogy.
Yeah, yeah. God is the divine multitasker, if you will,
You
right?
gotta go put Lily Tomlin in my mind. And now I can see her saying, is this the person to whom I am speaking?
Yes. Is this the person to whom I am speaking?
And you gotta snort too.
All right. Let's get the commentary in. All right. The
But
problem.
this thing about the voice of God,
Yes.
calling you by name or something, that'd be akin to the fact that at some point in your life you may hear God speaking to you, not in an audible voice, but it's
Oh, yeah.
something that you prayed about, right?
Yeah, and this is a
Right?
beautiful thing too, because it always kind of frustrated me when I'd be listening to the radio. It typically happens on Protestant or evangelical radio stations, and they would say something like, I was preparing for my sermon today, and God told me, I want you to preach about this, and I want you to,
Right.
and I'm thinking, and this is, in my conversion, becoming, going from an atheist to a believer, and I'm like, wow, I can't wait till,
Get the voice, yeah.
I'm getting these daily, check-ins from God. Hey, by the way, Kent, listen, before you brush your teeth, would you do me a favor? And,
But
and honestly, that's never happened. I've never had, anything like that.
That's never happened. But if you, like for example, yesterday I went to the 12 o'clock mass up at St. Andrews, the noontime mass, and Father Hal when you listen to his homily.
Oh, aren't they
They're
wonderful?
fabulous, and he's
Oh.
not looking at anything. It's related to exactly what is in the, and he makes this perfect analogy.
Right.
So, and you think to yourself, now somewhere, I mean, he's just such a,
knowledgeable.
he's very knowledgeable,
when-
and he makes it very easy for
when you-
you to understand and to follow.
It's a gift. They call
It's a
that the
gift.
gift of counsel,
Yeah.
the ability to explain things in such a way that
There's no possible
we
way
can-
you can
right.
say, I don't
See, now,
get it.
when you said Hal, I thought of Space Odyssey 2001.
Yeah,
Hal.
I don't know, I don't watch that.
you're making all
I'm
these
saying.
pop cultural connections
I know,
today.
that's crazy.
Bill.
I'm
so-
sorry.
Yeah, the idea is that God does speak to us, and He
Right.
speaks in various ways, and it's great in the
And
epistle
through
to
other
the
people, of
Hebrews.
course.
And through
Yes,
other
yes.
people.
So God's got lots of messengers, and God's got lots of means. I mean, sometimes we see something, and I remember one time a good example of this is I was working a temp job in Salem and living in North Billerica, and that commute was brutal. It was, some days it would take, I think it's 14 miles, and some days it would take me 2 hours, 2.5 hours
Yeah.
to make that commute. And I remember one day, but it was, it was a kind of office where you never saw your clients. You just worked in a cubicle, and your clients were in, all over the country. And so, we could wear jeans and a t-shirt, shorts and a t-shirt, sandals, sneakers, pretty casual, which was nice. I mean, I thought that was great. And one day I was just, brutalized by my commute, and I'm just, feeling very sorry for myself. And we had to park in one building, and then there was a skywalk to another building. You'd walk through that building, and then there was a skywalk to the building I worked in. And so I'm going through one of these skywalks, and I'm just looking out the window, and I'm just so frustrated about my commute and hating life. And I'm looking out the window as I'm walking across this skywalk, and I see there's one of these vans, and the side doors are open, and there's one of these lifts letting a man in a wheelchair out of the van and letting him down. And here's this man sitting in his wheelchair on this lift, coming out of the side of the van, and he's got his briefcase in his lap, and he's dressed impeccably in a suit and tie, and he's just sitting there with nice shoes on his feet. And he's getting let out and put on the ground. And I stopped and I looked at, as all these thoughts of how miserable my life was because I had a 2-hour commute, I see this guy and I thought, he went through more this morning just to get out the door. Just to get out the door than I'll have to deal with all day, maybe in a week, right? And this guy's doing this every day, and he's in a suit and tie, and I'm in shorts and a t-shirt, right?
What am I complaining about?
And so it was that, you look at situations like that and you think, that's probably God put that guy in my path today, you don't want to go crazy with this stuff. I remember there was
We all do it.
Yeah, there was a Saturday Night Live episode where Sally Field, I remember, was hosting Saturday Night Live, and she was playing this, a fundamentalist, I guess, evangelical Christian, and she was a housewife, and everything she did, she would say a prayer first. Oh, Lord, as I wash these dishes, be with me and use this act to, draw me closer to you, and, help me to wash the dishes so my skin doesn't get dried out, and, I get this, that, and then she'd move on and she'd oh, Lord, help me to vacuum well, and blah, every single thing. And all of a sudden, Jesus appears, and she says, oh, my Lord, and he said, yeah, listen. I just wanted to say, I really appreciate where your heart is. But really, every little thing, I've got, famines in parts of the world that I'm dealing with right now. So you don't want to.
I've often thought of that.
Yeah.
My list is so puny compared to the real.
Yeah, exactly.
I know.
But and by the way, there's nothing wrong with praying that washing the dishes somehow does you use that time.
You can make a morning offering when you get up.
Absolutely.
Well, sometimes that praying when you're doing the dishes or whatever is very good because it distracts you from the stuff that's causing you to grumble.
Oh my goodness, right.
So, I'm standing there doing the dishes and it's like, okay, a Hail Mary at this particular moment
would not be a bad thing, So
So if you did the dishes, it would be beneficial. I just thought-
sanctifying
No, if every time you
mortification.
she said a Hail Mary, that would be beneficial.
Wear out all her rosary beads.
So the point is, you don't want to go saying everything you see is some sort of omen from God.
No.
And, you could push the envelope a bit too much. But the point is, God can use anything to speak. He can. It's not necessarily saying that he is, but he certainly can. And so you have to be open to this. Yeah. And the way I've talked before about how I heard a priest give a homily in which he talked about a game that he played as a kid with his brothers and sisters called Whose Shoes. And when they were in bed at night, all in the same bedroom with the lights out, they would play this game where you had to guess who was walking through the house just by knowing the sound of their footsteps. And the connection he made was, we ought to know Christ so well that when we, so to speak, we hear the footsteps passing by, we know that they're Christ. So when we get some sort of inclination, we know whether that's coming from God or not. And so the point is, how do you get to know Christ so intimately that you recognize this is from God and this is not? Prayer, the sacraments.
Prayer for the grace to recognize
to hear it.
Exactly.
Recognize it.
Exactly. If you study the Bible, be fully engaged at Mass, be fully engaged in prayer, just go to confession frequently, frequent reception of communion, you will recognize Christ when he's speaking to you, and whether or not it's just, coming from some other source, whether it's your own ego or some worse supernatural source.
Whose energy do they have? Yours or Gloria's?
I guess both. It's hard to say, but they're just kids. They've got energy. I wish I had theirs, let alone them having mine. All right, so let's read the commentary. The promise of the hidden manna to the victors can be seen as a counter to the sin of indulging in idolatrous meals. So Jesus is saying some of you are being forced or tricked into eating food that was sacrificed to idols. And so what I'm going to do, if you conquer, if you resist, if you endure to the end, I am going to give you the true divine banquet, right? So it's sort of a contrast, and you see this a lot in the Gospels when Jesus makes contrasts, right? The man who built his house on rock versus the man who built his house on sand, things like that, right? So here are his Christians in Pergamum, some of whom are being forced to or tricked into, or maybe voluntarily doing it, which is worse, participating in pagan banquets, food sacrificed to pagan idols. And he's saying, if you conquer, I will give you the true, authentic, sublime, ultimate divine banquet, right? St. Paul also contrasts sacrifices to idols with the Eucharistic sacrifice and tells the Corinthians that they cannot, quote, drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons, cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. So this is this happens a lot, right? We want to be faithful Catholics, but we somehow want to accommodate people who are doing things that are anti-Catholic or, incompatible, I should say, with the Catholic faith. And we try to kind of juggle both of these things at once, whereas really at some point, look, if you're going to follow any way of life, it means you have to exclude certain things, right? I mean, just think of a diet, right? If I'm going to follow this certain diet, I have to exclude certain things that are not included on the diet. right? Well, if you're going to be a Catholic, if you, with all of your faculties, have come to the authentic conclusion that the Catholic Church is the medium of the truth of everything, right? Why we're here, how we got here, what we're supposed to do while we're here, what awaits us after we're here. If you have come to the conclusion that the Catholic Church has the truth, following the truth necessitates excluding things that are incompatible with it. And they're pinpointing a certain thing that's incompatible with following the truth. It's following error, right? Following error is incompatible with following the truth. The two can't coincide. And so this is what Jesus is getting at. This is what Paul is talking about.
Isn't the difficulty sometimes, though, excluding some of those things or people in a loving way?
Exactly.
Right?
Because the
Isn't that
problem
what it
is
really?
we get so caught up in, right? Like if someone meets you at a party and they say, "Hi, Bill, nice to meet you. Tell me about yourself." You want to go into, I'm a retired whatever, or I do this for a living, or I do. The first thing people tend to think is, right, their careers.
Right.
Right? But the thing is, when God looks at you, does he look at you and say, "My faithful engineer"?
No.
Right? Does he say, my daughter, the bus driver? Now, granted, anything you could do as a career can be devoted to the work of God, right? However, your essence, your core is not what you do. Your essence is who you are, right?
What defines you?
So that means I can quit dusting, right?
Yes, exactly. No, there was an interview with Pope Francis shortly after becoming a pope, and the interviewer asked him, "Who is Jorge Maria Bergoglio?" And he paused and he thought, and he said, "A sinner."
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
He didn't say, "Oh, well, I grew up in Argentina, and my parents were from Italy, and we had a wonderful family life, and I used to play, soccer, and then as I got older, I had this great conversion, and I wanted to give my..." He didn't
Didn't say any of that, no.
He said one thing:
A sinner.
a sinner. Right? So, what we need to realize is what we are, right? And what is that compatible with, right? The analogy is an automobile, right? You take an automobile. Is it compatible with the nature of the automobile, if we could use the word nature for an automobile, to pour tomato juice in the gas tank? Not at all. According to I'll use the word nature, but according to the nature of an automobile, you have to put gasoline in the tank, right? Otherwise, it's not going to work, right? You could pour oil in the gas tank, and it might kind of work, but it's going to smoke like crazy. You're going to gum up your engine, and it's flammable like gasoline, but it's not going to work, right?
One of my kids wanted to be helpful, took the water hose and filled up
lovely.
the grandfather's tank.
Yikes.
Oh.
Lovely. So the point, and this is a good example, if you're not doing what is
How did you fix that?
suited to your nature,
So many years ago, my father
you're
took care of
you're
it.
doing harm to yourself, right? So what he's saying is, look, you were not made to eat the flesh of animals sacrificed to idols. You were made for divine life in you. Now, when you think of it, you kind of break it down. Why were pagans doing this? Well, the idea, how beautiful. Perfect.
Oh.
Are you going to save it for her? Yeah. Good girl. Maybe you could color it in.
Eat 'em up.
When you think about it, look, if I see, if let's say I'm a soldier in the ancient world, and I see a bull, and I think, man, I wish I had that kind of strength, right? You think, well, maybe if I drank his blood, where's the power in a bull? Where does it come from? Maybe if I drank his blood, or maybe if I ate his flesh, right? Maybe if I skinned him and then I put on the skin of the bull, maybe the head of the bull, and I wore it like that, and I prayed to some bull god, that I would, do some kind of bull god dance and all, and maybe I'd have the power of the bull. Well, guess what? It turns out that there's an ancient cult of Mithra, which had to do with bulls, and soldiers generally participated in this cult.
So then you're talking, that's the real thing.
Yes, and they would sacrifice a bull. Sometimes they would be these temples would be constructed where they'd have a bull on a grate in the floor, and then you'd be under the floor, like I guess you could say in the basement, and you'd be like this, and they'd slash the bull's throat up there on the grate, and the blood would come gushing down and pour over you like that, and then they collect blood in the cup, and you drink the whole idea was, I want...
Strong like a bull.
Yes, strong like bull. The whole idea was, how do I get the bull's life in me? Right? So now, fast forward and think of when Jesus Christ comes on the scene, and he says, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. What is he saying?
In order to...
You need you don't need the life of a bull. That's a beast. That's an animal. You shouldn't strive to lower yourself to the level of an animal. You're made in the image and likeness of God. You need to fulfill that by eating my flesh and drinking my blood and having divine life in you. And by the way, who's more powerful, God or the bull? So, this is what Jesus is getting at. So, why was it such a terrible thing to eat the flesh and drink the blood of animals sacrificed to false gods? A, you're either placing yourself in the hand of demonic spirits, or at the very least, you're deluding yourself. At the very least, you're following an illusion. Because eating the flesh and drinking the blood of a bull is not going to give you a bull's strength. Hey, a good steak is, right in hell. It's got that iron and the protein. That's great. But you're not going to be as strong as a bull, okay? So the point is, Jesus is saying, at the very least, you're deluding yourself. Worse, you could be handing yourself over to darker forces. But what should you be doing?
Just like he says here.
You should be striving to be in communion with God. Eat his flesh and drink his blood, and this is what he's promising, right? Elsewhere, yes.
In the Old Testament, God had them killing lambs.
Yes.
Putting the blood on the
Right.
doors,
Yep.
eating the flesh.
Yep.
So there was a lot of that. Even
Right.
sacrificing animals.
Sorry.
Putting the blood all over the altar.
Yeah, right.
There was, that is culturally.
Exactly.
that was in
Yes.
their
So
blood.
why and you look and you see that God is more or less, he tells them what to sacrifice, right? Through Moses. So what is the point? A couple of things are going on there. Number one, they're doing, on the surface, they're doing what every other pagan nation is doing. They're sacrificing animals, right? You dig a little deeper and you realize when God tells Moses, I want you to go back to Egypt, tell Pharaoh, let my people go into the wilderness for 3 days so we could make sacrifices to our God. And God says, I want you to sacrifice cattle, sheep, and goats. And Moses goes back to Pharaoh and he says, let us go for 3 days into the wilderness. We'll make our sacrifices and we'll come back. And Pharaoh says, why can't you make your sacrifices here? And Moses says, our sacrifices are an abomination to the Egyptians. The Egyptians worshipped cattle gods, sheep gods, and goat gods. So it's kind of like you hear about in India, the cows, the sacred cows are wandering around. If you kill one, you're in big trouble, especially if you do it on purpose, right? You're in big trouble. Well, if you're walking around Egypt killing their gods, right, you're in big trouble. So Moses says, no, we got to do this out in the wilderness. And Pharaoh says, no, and then Pharaoh's obstinate, so God says, okay, now you got to let him go forever. And we all know what happens next. So what God does by telling them to sacrifice cattle, sheep, and goats is to separate them from the Egyptians. Perfect. Bring it home. And then, so he's trying to get them to not to identify with the Egyptians, right? After Moses brings them out, what are they saying over and over again? We want to go back to Egypt, right? Can't we go back, right? This God is just drawing us out here to kill us, so we die out here. At least we were slaves in Egypt. At least we had food, right? So the God is their bellies, right? So God is trying to break them away from the Egyptians. It's like, I've heard it put this way. God wanted to take the Israelites out of Egypt to take Egypt out of the Israelites, right? So then they're sacrificing cattle, sheep, and goats to remember we can't go back, right? The Egyptians would never have us with killing their gods, right? Number one. Number two, in the long run, what is the sacrifice of cattle, sheep, and goats? And St. Paul talks about this. What does it show the Israelites? It doesn't do anything. It does nothing. Sacrificing cattle, sheep, and goats, we're still a mess. We're still sinners. We still get into trouble. So what kind of sacrifice is it going to take for us to truly achieve holiness and happiness? Christ comes on the scene and says, here's what you got to do. You have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Now that you understand the futility of the old covenant sacrifices, now I'm going to give you the true sacrifice. Like he says, your ancestors ate manna in the desert and they died. I am the true bread that came down from heaven. He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life in him. He who does not eat my flesh and drink my blood has no life in him. And then he says, my flesh is true food. My blood is true drink. Right? So when he's using this word true, he's not just saying, that's real food and it's not the plastic fruit bowl on the middle. He's not saying there's fake food and there's real food. When he's saying true, he means sublime, transcendent food. Food that is supernatural food, right? When we look at the chalice after the wine has been consecrated, what? It looks like wine, smells like wine, tastes like wine. But supernaturally, it has transcended what's called its accidents, its smell, its taste, etc. Right? This has now become supernaturally the blood of our incarnate, died and risen Lord. When we look at that wafer, and the priest says these words that logically don't make sense with what we're looking at, the body of Christ. On one level, you want to look at that and say, that's just, I don't know, a cracker or something. When he says the body of Christ, he's speaking the truth. But it is a supernatural truth. You put it under the microscope, it's still going to look like a wheat wafer, right? But let me ask you this. If you were around 2,000 years ago, right, and you're in Jesus's carpenter shop, and he's cutting something, and he cuts his finger, and he cuts off a piece of flesh. If you had grabbed that flesh and put it under the microscope, would you see divinity?
No.
No. You'd see human flesh, right? You can't see the divinity in a microscope. But was he divine?
Yeah.
He was. But divinity itself doesn't have matter to it, right? There's no divine matter per se by itself, right? We can take natural matter and imbue it with divinity, but that's going to be invisible, right? So when he says this is true food and it's true drink, he's saying that, look, it's still going to look like bread, it's still going to taste like wine, smell like wine, etc. But in truth, it's divinity. These things transformed into divine matter, you could say, right? Jesus says to the Samaritan woman at the well that there is a day coming when we will worship in spirit and truth, right? He's associating truth with spirit, which is immaterial, right? So he imbues bread and wine with this eternal, transcendent, sublime reality, right? So if you're imbued with that, why would you want to go and partake of something lower, like a pagan sacrifice. He's saying, what you're doing is you're saying, it's almost like you're saying, I want to cover my bets, right? I'm going to take Jesus' sacrifice, and I'm going to take the pagan sacrifice, and I'm going to, just have a lot of irons in the fire. But the reality is, by the very nature of the true sacrifice, participating in the other sacrifices spoils the effect of participating in the true sacrifice, right? So he's saying, don't do that, right? And he says, you cannot have two masters, right? When he's talking about money, right? God and manna or stuff, right? You can't try to divide your allegiances between God and false gods or, demonic spirits, right? You're not going to get the effect of any of it, right? So you find the truth and you're faithful to it.
I don't have a phone.
Not mine.
So we're going to have to leave it there. We are out of time. I kept